All right. So, what I'm going to do is talk about how to explain and apply economic theory to the article, as well as kind of give some evaluation and dig deeper into the idea of sugary drinks, the tax on it to fight obesity. So, that's basically kind of the two things I'll talk about in the video is applying theory as the article kind of states, and then kind of going a little bit deeper and evaluating its effects. So the WHO is wanting people or people in the world, governments of the world, to tax sugary drinks because they believe that there's a negative externality on the consumption side. So here's our market that is inefficient because of the existence of negative external benefits. So if I get that right. So then socially optimal quantity, socially optimal price, and because society wants less, here's my welfare loss. The idea is society wants less because of the existence of an externality, and they talk about obesity, and therefore the market quantity, the quantity that's currently being produced and consumed, is greater than what we want as a society to be able to consume. So their fix for that is going to be a tax. So how do we get the market quantity closer to QSO? Is taxes, regulations, but in this case, the government or the WHO is saying that the governments of the world should tax sugary drinks. So now we look at the market with a tax on sugary drinks. So we start off with the market, supply and demand. Okay, the overproduction and consumption. So we want, and they mention a 20% tax. So I'm going to put that in, supply plus 20%. Okay, so if we're really kind of working on the article, it talks about governments should tax sugary drinks, and 20% is kind of at least what's mentioned in the article. So we're going to raise the price to reduce consumption. Now in this case, there is no deadweight loss. So although there's still this triangle here, there is no deadweight loss because society wanted less, and so now by the government taxing, they're going to get less. As well as the government is going to generate tax revenue, which is here, which then they can use for other social programs perhaps to try to lessen the consumption and the effects of sugary drinks by maybe providing some healthy initiative for schools, or providing funding for advertising or other educational programs to try to keep kids from drinking sugary drinks. Now, getting into some of the evaluation. So, would the tax on sugary drinks be effective? The answer is probably yes. By having the tax, it is going to reduce consumption. There are substitutes for sugary drinks, such as drinking water, drinking less sugary drinks. So there are ways around the tax, so the buyers don't necessarily need to pay. And they're kind of claiming that it's unit-elastic based on their research, and it's hard to refute that. But ultimately, tax on sugary drinks, there are substitutes for. And sugary drinks are kind of a luxury. So I'd argue that without the actual data that its demand is pretty elastic. So in terms of stakeholders, the government is certainly going to win. They're going to benefit because they're going to receive tax dollars that they can use then for other means, or to further the cause of reducing sugary drink consumption, such as providing educational programs. Producers are going to be worse off because they're going to lose production. The quantity is going down, and they're going to have to pay for the tax, at least some of that. So they're going to receive less revenue and less profit. So they're going to be worse off. Consumers are going to be at least somewhat worse off because they're paying the higher price and consuming less. So that consumer surplus is shrinking, producer surplus is shrinking, and the government tax revenue is there. And society, when government taxes, is going to be better off because the reduction of the deadweight loss from the tax. So kind of in going through the stakeholders analysis and evaluation, that's kind of what we're looking at from the stakeholder standpoint. Now, to dig a little bit deeper into evaluation, we have to kind of discuss, is there a negative externality, or is there an externality at all on sugary drinks? So the idea is, if I just kind of sketch out real quick, that we've talked about before that supply is the private cost of production. There's no external costs on the production side, so that's going to be the social cost as well. And then here is the private benefit, the idea that when I drink sugary drinks, I benefit, just like when I smoke. That's the private benefit. The smoker knows what the effects are and are kind of willing to accept that. And that's their private benefit, and that's kind of their prerogative. So is there an externality? That ends up being the question. So what are the effects external to the individual? And the idea is that government can still put a kind of like a sin tax on like tobacco or alcohol or sugary drinks, but ultimately, is there an externality? It's kind of hard to argue. Yes, the individual is going to be negatively impacted, but again, that's part of the private benefit. And if you really wanted to kind of talk about the cost, but that's really on the supply side. So there's no real external negative impact on society from the consumption of sugary drinks at the surface. But kind of getting into, so is there an externality? Kind of questioning the article and digging deeper. And if there is an externality, what is it? So we can't just say like, oh, society wants less. Well, maybe it's better for the individual, but is society actually going to feel the effects of that? And the answer is probably, because the article goes in and talks about the obesity. And again, if somebody's obese, and because of sugary drinks and other choices, more than likely, then that's on the private benefit side. The private benefit includes anything that's negative or positive on the individual. So when society gets hurt and there is that external negative benefit, that's going to be an increased healthcare cost. So if those workers can't find work, if those workers are going to be put on disability, if those workers are going to go on Social Security sooner, if they're going to be a drain on Medicare funds and put the government more in debt, that there probably is some sort of negative external benefit on some group that equals the externality, or that is the externality. But it's certainly something that needs to be thought of, not just kind of taken for granted by us, that, oh, there's an externality, so we're going to tax it and this and that. And we have to think about what is that externality going to be. It's not just like, oh, when somebody smokes, there's an externality. Well, what is that? Well, it's the negative effects felt by a third person. And secondhand smoke is easier to comprehend than perhaps this example. But ultimately, that's what we're digging into, is there is an externality, but we do have to mention and kind of talk about that. And this is the evaluation. This is digging deeper into econ about, thinking about these things. So the article itself is somewhat economical, but it's certainly not written by an economist, I would argue. It's written more by a journalist, which makes it a good article because it gets a little bit into the economics, but ultimately, as we're choosing our article for the IA, which you're going to get into later today, then this would be a really good article to write about, because it's not totally economics, and there's a lot of room for your voice to come through. Lastly, to connect this topic in this article to kind of events closer to home, last year, a couple years ago, there was a 1 cent per ounce tax on Cook County sugary drinks, which basically included, let's just say, pop, just to make things simple. So any pop that was sold in Cook County, and there's lots of parts to the law. The laws are, usually 100 pages long or longer sometimes. So I'm not going to get into all the details, but let's just say it's on pop. So if you're going to buy a 12-ounce can of Pepsi, you're going to pay, maybe the 75 cents plus a 12-cent tax on top of whatever the normal Cook County tax you'd pay on pop, which is probably about 7.5%. So you end up paying a lot more than just the 75-cent sticker price for the can of Pepsi or Coke. Now, when they did this, Cook County eventually repealed this tax, stating that they were doing it not to reduce the consumption of sugary drinks to fight obesity, but simply to raise tax money. The Cook County especially needed money. They thought this would be a good way to get it, and they were wrong, so they ended up repealing the tax. So what the Cook County was thinking when they put the tax on is, yes, there's an externality, and the demand for sugary drinks, like people are just going to drink the pop no matter what. So when they put the tax on a 1 cent per ounce, so here's my original price before the tax and quantity. So the 1 cent per ounce is a specific tax because it's not a percentage based. So supply plus tax. And so what the government was hoping for was a pretty sizable government revenue, because people, really weren't, so buyers, price the sellers receive. So really it wasn't going to impact the sellers all that much. This is what they were thinking. So the quantity is not going to change, so really the buyers are going to be the ones burdened more by the tax than the sellers. So there's not going to be too many jobs lost because of that, because you're still going to sell about the same. And the government's going to get a nice big chunk of government revenue, so ultimately they can pay off a lot of the things that Cook County needs to pay for. So they were incorrect in thinking about that. So if we look at the market and we say, like, this is the market for pop or Pepsi or Coke, something specific, pop, let's go with the more generic phrase, then demand is inelastic for pop. However, what they failed to realize was that the market wasn't pop. The market was pop in Cook County. So pop doesn't have a lot of substitutes, but pop in Cook County does. You don't have to buy pop in Cook County. You're going to go to Indiana, you want to go to Will County, you want to go to Lake County, you want to go to DuPage County. You work somewhere else besides in the city, you go somewhere on a trip, and you end up just buying pop and bringing it back. There were lots of ways around the tax. So what actually happened, and the Cook County Board basically came out and said, this was about revenue, not about saving people's lives and fighting obesity. It was simply, we wanted the tax revenue. Was that demand was actually relatively elastic for sugary drinks in Cook County because there's a lot of other options. So when they placed the tax, supply plus tax, original quantity, what ended up happening was there was a much larger burden on the producers than they originally thought. So while they collected what appears to be still pretty sizable tax revenue, and I tried to make the shifts about the same distance to try to keep it somewhat similar, they didn't receive as much tax revenue as they thought, and most of the burden came on the sellers. So this is the seller burden, and then this little strip up here would be the buyer's burden. And so consumers weren't getting around the tax, so they weren't really paying for it. It was the sellers and the great decrease in quantity that lost jobs, cost total revenue for them, cost, likely profit for them. So it fell much greater on the sellers than it did the buyers. And the intent was to put the burden on the buyers so they actually consumed less. So ultimately they ended up, repealing the tax pretty quickly. I want to say it took effect about July 1, and then was repealed pretty shortly after school started that year. So it didn't last very long, but maybe a few months before they decided it wasn't a good idea. So that's, as promised, this was probably way more into this article than you could have expected. So hopefully this kind of helps. And good luck, and email me with any questions.